As a 19-year-old, how do you go about the process of convincing people that you know what you're doing and that you can pull it off?
Elizabeth Holmes is the former CEO and founder of the medical device company Theranos. And today we're going to be talking about how somebody like Elizabeth Holmes went from creating a $9 billion company to facing 20 years in prison. This is a crazy story, so you will not want to miss it. Let's get started.
Elizabeth Holmes.
To Elizabeth Holmes.
Elizabeth Holmes.
The woman who I will be interviewing needs no introduction. She is Elizabeth Holmes.
Elizabeth Holmes is a now 36-year-old former inventor and entrepreneur, and in 2003, at just 19 years old, she created the medical device company Theranos. She created this company while attending Stanford University, and after a period of time, she ended up dropping out of Stanford University to pursue Theranos full-time. Now, Theranos was a medical device company out of Silicon Valley, and they really rose to prominency around 2013. And their claim to fame was that they could conduct blood tests with an incredibly small amount of blood, and these tests were incredibly accurate that could then be tested for a slew of different medical conditions, including cancer. So Theranos was not only the device in which they tested the blood, but the technology behind it as well. And as a result, they really grew to prominency once these claims became mainstream. In fact, she was dubbed by a number of news agencies to be the next Steve Jobs. And between 2010 and 2015, she secured over $700 million in investor funding from prominent families like the Waltons or the founders of Walmart, who invested $150 million, from the Murdoch family, who invested $125 million, as well as the DeVos family, you know, Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, who invested $100 million in the medical device startup. At its absolute peak, Theranos had a valuation of $9 billion, and Elizabeth Holmes had a personal net worth of $4.5 billion. She was dubbed by a number of news outlets to be one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the world. Now, on the surface, everything was going right for Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. She had a successful company that was changing the world. She had millions and millions of dollars in investment. She had a billion-dollar company. But the problem is that it was all a fraud, and Elizabeth Holmes was simply defrauding all of these investors with fraudulent claims, with a bogus company, and with non-existent technology. You see, throughout the company history of Theranos, there had been a slew of red flags that were raised from employees and executives stating that the technology was not reliable. In fact, Elizabeth Holmes had her own in-house scientists tell her on a number of occasions that the tests simply were not working the way they should. In addition to the scientists, the Theranos CFO found out that she was lying to the media, to investors, to employees. He confronted her about this, told her she needed to stop, and as a result, he was fired on the spot. And Theranos was actually then left CFO list for over 10 years. But it all came crashing down whenever the Wall Street Journal published a series of articles stating that not only was the Theranos technology simply unreliable and ineffective, but that they were also using competitor third-party machines to run all of their in-house blood work. Meaning that whenever Theranos was running blood work, they were claiming that they were running it themselves on their own proprietary machines, when in actuality and behind closed doors, they were using just generic third-party competitor machines to run this test, because those proved to be more reliable than their own machines. Now, after these claims were released, Elizabeth Holmes was radio silent for 2 days, and apparently during that 2-day period of time, she was having war room meetings with expert legal teams, marketing teams, and press teams to figure out how to address the claims stated by the Wall Street Journal. But despite the advice that she received from her expert legal team, she instead decided to double down on herself and the Theranos technology. And just a few days after the Wall Street Journal articles were published, she actually appeared on CNBC for an on-air interview where she essentially said that this type of article is what happens whenever you are trying to change the world. So essentially blaming this article and these apparent fraudulent claims that were published on the fact that her and her company were changing the world, and that's why she was getting backlash, not because of the fact that anything in the article was actually valid.
This is what happens when you work to change things, and first they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world.
But despite the fact that Elizabeth Holmes seemed to double down on her company, her technology, and Theranos as a whole, she still was investigated by a slew of federal organizations, including the FDA, and eventually ended up receiving sanctions from a slew of different health organizations prohibiting her from owning or operating a laboratory. And then in June of 2018, she and her former co-founder were indicted on 11 counts of wire fraud, as well as a slew of different counts of conspiracy conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and in 2018, she stepped down as the Theranos CEO. And now as we sit here today, despite the fact that there was real efforts made into selling Theranos has decided to cease operations altogether, so they cease to exist today in November of 2020, and Elizabeth Holmes is currently facing 20 years in prison. Her court date was actually supposed to be in October of 2020, so just about a month ago, but it was pushed back to spring of 2021 due to COVID-19. Now, what is important to remember is what she is really being indicted for, and it really isn't just wire fraud, even though those are the official charges. What Elizabeth Holmes is being indicted for, or what she has been indicted for, and what she is facing charges for, is just massive amounts of fraud and pitching a company that she knew didn't work, that she knew didn't have the technology she was claiming it had, and swindling investors out of nearly $700 million. So now that we know what Theranos does and we know who Elizabeth Holmes is, now begs the question of how was Elizabeth Holmes able to pull all of this off? Now, Elizabeth Holmes started this company whenever she was 19, and now she's 36. Whenever all of the news broke about the company and the fraud, she was only 32. And in that amount of time, she was able to start a huge multi-billion-dollar company that was completely illegitimate. She was able to get herself on the front cover of dozens of magazines. She was able to secure over $700 million in funding from extremely prominent wealthy families, and she was able to get the mainstream media to claim her as the next Steve Jobs. And so we have to ask the question of how is that possible? Now, to be honest, whenever I was doing the research for this video, I searched everywhere to figure out how this was able to be possible. How could somebody convince the DeVos family or the Walton family or the Murdoch family to give hundreds of millions of dollars to a startup and a company that had nothing legitimate behind it? And really, the only answer I was able to gather from that is the fact that she is an incredibly good manipulator. You see, Elizabeth Holmes was an incredible manipulator, and she was incredibly intentional and calculated with almost everything that she did. For example, Elizabeth Holmes intentionally lowers her voice significantly to come off significantly deeper than her natural voice, because studies show that deeper voices invoke a sense of authority and success compared to higher tone voices.
It hasn't. Well, if I use traditional words to describe what we're doing, it's hard because people then associate it with conventional processes.
Not only this, but if you listen to interviews with her, she's extremely calculated. She talks extremely slowly, and you can see that she's thinking about everything that she's saying. At one point, even she was pulled into a boardroom meeting where she was said to have been fired as CEO, and before she left the meeting, she was able to reconvince the board to allow her to keep her job. Not only the fact that she's obviously very good at manipulation and convincing people to do what she wants to do, but she was also incredibly obsessed with secrecy and protecting the proprietary information of Theranos. For example, whenever investors would sign on to the company, she would put in the contract that she was not required to reveal any information, proprietary or not, about how the blood work or the machines worked that Theranos used. So people like the Waltons, the DeVos family, these people were investing hundreds of millions of dollars, and they really signed away their right to digging into the details and the nitty-gritty stuff about how the company itself worked. Now, all in all, I think that it's incredibly hard to figure out exactly how Elizabeth Holmes swindled so many people out of so much money. But in my opinion, I think that it really comes down to two things. One, I think it comes down to the fact that she was extremely good at selling, and I think that she was a really great manipulator. She convinced you that she was what she wanted you to think she was, and it didn't really matter the fact that she had no basis or no evidence to support that. I mean, she was selling a non-existent product to billionaires and getting them to sign over hundreds of millions of dollars in checks. But it wasn't just the investors that got swindled, it was the mainstream media as well. And they were kind of the second component as to why I think Elizabeth Holmes was able to be so successful in her scheme. And that's the mainstream media labeling her as the next Steve Jobs, as one of the most successful women in history, as the youngest self-made billionaire. She was featured on so many magazines, interviewed by so many prominent news outlets, and that kind of invoked a fake sense of credibility around her and Theranos. It's kind of like that fake it till you make it mindset. Elizabeth Holmes was faking it. She had been since 2003. And once the mainstream media stepped in and was kind of feeding off of that fakeness, it was so much easier to add legitimacy to her claims. Once the mainstream media picked up her story, it wasn't really a matter of validating her product because she could just point to the dozens of different articles written about her. She goes to an investor, pitches Theranos and the technology behind it, and whenever they ask for how they can trust whether or not she's credible, she doesn't need to send them an audit of her technology or an audit of her company. She can just say, well, check out this Forbes article that was written about me, or see this Times article that I was on the cover of. There is a sense of credibility that comes with being covered on mainstream media news outlets. And I think in a way, they really enabled her to take advantage of some of these big time investors. There has been a lot of studies and publications done on both Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos and kind of the story behind both of them. And there's been a lot of conclusions that have been drawn on how exactly she was able to do exactly what she did. For example, there's a lot of credible sources out there that claim as though Elizabeth Holmes is a sociopath, which is one of the reasons why she was able to do what she did so successfully. Now, I'm not a behavioral analyst and I don't really know a whole lot about sociopathic tendencies, but I will say that I think that all in all, the way that she was able to do what she did was, number one, she's a great manipulator, and number two, the media allowed her an environment and a platform to speak upon herself and Theranos and the technology that she claimed to have, and that really allowed for her to sell herself on a much broader scale. And I think that these two things combined allowed for her to swindle investors out of $700 million, to create a $9 billion value company with no real value to it at all, and eventually it's going to end up being what is going to send her to prison for potentially 20 years. But with that being said, you guys, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a comment down below. Make sure to hit that like button. This type of video takes me a lot longer to make compared to my normal types of videos I make because there's just so much more research and editing that needs to be done. But if you guys enjoy it, let me know in the comments and I can definitely do more of these. And don't forget to subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. And I will see you guys in the next video.